The air inside the auditorium was thick with tension. Hundreds of people filled the rows of plush red seats, some leaning forward, some whispering nervously. But on the grand stage, beneath the glow of harsh studio lights, there were only two men. At one podium stood J.D. Vance, his presence calm, steady, unshaken. His navy blue suit was sharp, his tie perfectly knotted. But it wasn't his appearance that commanded attention, it was his silence. He didn't fidget, he didn't shift, he simply waited. At the opposite podium, however, stood Ethan Calloway, a man who once called Vance his brother in arms. But that was years ago. The Ethan Calloway of today was different. His suit a little flashier, his smirk a little sharper, his hands gripping the edges of the podium as if trying to steady himself. The crowd could feel it, something unspoken, something unresolved hanging heavy between the two. Then the moderator cleared his throat. The debate was about to begin. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carefully measured, "let's get straight to it. The two of you were once allies, friends. You built a movement together, but now you stand on opposite sides of the political divide. And tonight, the American people want to know what happened." Silence. Calloway was the first to break it. "What happened?" he repeated, his voice laced with sarcasm. "I'll tell you what happened. My opponent here," he gestured toward Vance, "decided that principles could be, well, flexible. He decided that power mattered more than honesty. He turned his back on the very people he swore to fight for." The words hit like a punch, but Vance didn't flinch. He stood still, his expression unreadable. A ripple ran through the audience. Calloway was making it personal, and everyone could feel it. "You want to talk about betrayal, Ethan?" Vance finally spoke, his voice measured, steady. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze locked onto his former friend. "Let's talk about who really changed." The crowd leaned in. The energy in the room shifted. Calloway let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh, I didn't change, J.D. I stayed true to what we built. You became something else entirely, and you know it." Vance exhaled, slow and deliberate. He looked past the lights, past the cameras, past the rows of watching eyes, as if seeing something far beyond this moment. "This isn't about politics," Vance said, his voice like iron wrapped in velvet. "This is about something deeper." A pause. "It's about integrity," Calloway scoffed. "Integrity?" He turned slightly, as if addressing the audience now. Funny word coming from a man who stood beside me, shoulder to shoulder, fighting the establishment, until suddenly he realized the establishment could be useful. Vance's eyes narrowed. Not in anger, not in frustration, but in recognition. This was not just a debate. This was a reckoning. "This is going to be interesting," the moderator muttered under his breath, barely audible, as the crowd buzzed with anticipation. Because everyone in that room knew. This wasn't just a political battle. This was personal, and neither man was going to back down. But how did it come to this? To understand, we have to go back to a time when they were on the same side. Before the cameras, before the headlines, before the betrayal. There was brotherhood. It was 5 years ago. The world was different then. The movement they were building felt fresh, untouchable. They weren't politicians. They weren't strategists. They were fighters, scrappy outsiders taking on the system. J.D. Vance and Ethan Calloway. Back then, their names meant something together. They weren't just colleagues. They were friends. The kind of friends who called each other at 2 a.m., debating ideas deep into the night. The kind who watched each other's backs when the media came swinging. And on one particular night, one that would change everything, they were sitting at a dimly lit diner somewhere in the heart of Ohio. The place was small, the kind of spot where the coffee wasn't great, but the company mattered more. The booth was cramped, but neither of them cared. Their voices were low, urgent, and full of fire. "We have to keep the message clear," Calloway insisted, stabbing his fork into a half-eaten plate of fries. "We're not like them, JD. We're fighting for the people who don't have a voice, the ones Washington forgot." Vance nodded, but something in his face was different. He wasn't just agreeing, he was thinking, calculating, seeing something on the horizon that Calloway wasn't. "That's exactly why we have to be careful," Vance said, leaning forward. "We're growing, Ethan. This isn't just a protest anymore, it's a movement. And if we're going to win, we have to start thinking bigger." Calloway laughed, shaking his head. "Bigger? JD, bigger means compromise. Bigger means playing their game. We swore we wouldn't do that." Vance looked at him, long and hard. And then he said something that Calloway would never forget. "Maybe the game isn't as simple as we thought." The air between them shifted. Calloway's smile faded just slightly. His fingers tapped against the table, restless. He could sense it, the beginning of a crack, the smallest fracture in what had always been unshakable. "You're starting to sound like them," he muttered, barely above a whisper. Vance didn't flinch. "No, I'm starting to see the reality." Silence. For the first time, they weren't on the same page. Outside, the diner's neon sign flickered against the dark Ohio sky. A waitress poured more coffee, not realizing she was witnessing the start of something that years later would lead to war. That night, they left the diner together, but walked away with very different ideas of the future. And in the months that followed, the cracks grew wider. More disagreements, more tension. Ethan wanted purity, no compromises, no softening their stance. Vance wanted progress, to win the war, not just the battles. They didn't hate each other, not yet. But they had begun walking two separate roads that would eventually collide in a way neither of them could have predicted. One moment changed everything, and there was no going back. Betrayal doesn't happen in an instant. It happens in pieces, small moments, quiet decisions, 100 little cracks that go unnoticed until the whole foundation collapses. For J.D. Vance and Ethan Calloway, that collapse came on a night neither of them would ever forget. It was supposed to be a celebration. The ballroom at the Grand Oak Hotel was packed. Supporters, donors, reporters, all gathered to witness the next big step for their movement. It was a night of speeches, of promises, of momentum. Vance stood near the stage, hands in his pockets, scanning the room. He could feel it, the energy, the hunger, the expectation. They were on the verge of something real. And then he saw him, Calloway, across the room, shaking hands, smiling, but not with their people, with them. The ones they had fought against, the media executives, the establishment insiders, the same people who had mocked them, dismissed them, fought to silence them. Vance's jaw tightened. He didn't move right away. He just watched. Watched as his oldest ally crossed a line that couldn't be undone. And then, the moment that changed everything. Calloway stepped onto the stage. Vance hadn't been told about this. He hadn't been warned. But there he was, walking toward the podium, adjusting his microphone, clearing his throat. And then, he spoke. I want to start by saying something that may surprise some of you. The room stilled. Vance's fingers curled into fists. He already knew this was going to be bad. Calloway exhaled as if shaking off a weight. Movements evolve, and sometimes the people within them must evolve too. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Vance's chest felt tight. I know some of you might not want to hear this, but it needs to be said. Calloway's voice was steady, but there was something else in it. Something calculated. If we want real change, we can't cling to the past. We can't pretend that every battle is worth fighting. We need to be smarter, We need to be strategic. And then, the final blow. That's why I can no longer support the kind of rhetoric we've been pushing. Silence. The room was frozen. Some people exchanged nervous glances. Some looked angry, others confused. And Vance? He just stared. Not in shock, not in anger, but in understanding. He saw it clearly now. Calloway wasn't making a speech. He was making a break. A clean, public break. From the movement. From their fight. From everything they had built together. And he wasn't done. I know there are some who will call this a betrayal, Calloway continued, his voice controlled, his words sharp. But I refuse to be trapped in the past. I refuse to let our movement become defined by division. We must move forward. And that means leaving behind certain ideas. He didn't say Vance's name. He didn't have to. Vance felt every word like a knife. By the time Calloway stepped off that stage, it was over. The fracture that had been forming for months had finally split wide open, right in front of an entire room of witnesses. And by morning, it would be everywhere. The headlines, the interviews, the op-eds. Vance wasn't just dealing with a disagreement anymore. He was dealing with an opponent. And worst of all, it was someone who once called him a brother. And now, face to face once again, Vance has one last chance to set the record straight. There was an energy in the air, a crackling tension that everyone in the room could feel. The auditorium was packed, hundreds of spectators, reporters, and cameras, all aimed at the two men standing on the stage. The seats were filled with people who had followed their journey, who had seen them fight side by side, and were now here to watch them fight against each other. J.D. Vance stood at one podium, calm, still, unshaken. Ethan Calloway stood at the other, smirking, confident, ready for war. Between them, a moderator sat, adjusting his microphone, preparing to open the debate. But everyone in the room knew this wasn't about policy. This wasn't about a difference of opinion. This was a reckoning. The moderator cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, let's begin." A beat of silence. Then Calloway struck first. "You know, J.D.," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who had been on television 1,000 times. "It's funny to be standing here with you, because there was a time when I actually believed in you." He paused, letting the words sink in. "When we started this fight together, we wanted the same thing. To take on the elite, to stand up for the forgotten Americans, to hold Washington accountable." He turned slightly, addressing the audience. But somewhere along the way, something changed. And the truth is, J.D. Vance isn't the man I used to know. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded, others frowned. Vance? He didn't flinch, didn't react. He just let Calloway keep talking. Calloway exhaled, shaking his head in mock disappointment. The man who used to stand against corruption now defends it. The man who used to fight the establishment now shakes hands with them. And the man who swore he'd never sell out. Another pause. "Well, let's just say Washington made you a very rich man, didn't it?" The crowd shifted. Someone whispered something. A few reporters scribbled notes. A direct attack. A personal attack. And finally, Vance moved. Slowly, deliberately, he tilted his head, studying Calloway with an expression that was impossible to read. And then he spoke. "You're right, Ethan," Vance said, his voice even, his tone calm. "Something did change." Calloway's smirk faltered, just slightly. Vance leaned forward, resting his hands on the podium. "But it wasn't me." A hush fell over the room. "I didn't change, Ethan. I just saw the truth." He gestured toward Calloway, his eyes locked onto him like a hunter watching his prey. "But you? You didn't just change. You transformed. You evolved into something completely unrecognizable. And now you stand here, pretending that you're still fighting for the people." Another beat of silence. Vance let the words hang in the air. Then he shook his head. "No, Ethan, you're not fighting for the people anymore." His voice dropped just slightly, making every word land with weight. "You're fighting for the people who sign your checks." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, the sharp clicking of cameras as reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Calloway's expression froze, his smirk vanishing for the first time. Vance didn't blink. "You spent years standing next to me talking about corruption, talking about integrity, talking about holding power accountable." He tilted his head. "Tell me, Ethan, what happened to that man?" Calloway's fingers tightened around the edges of his podium. He opened his mouth to respond, to regain control. But Vance wasn't done. "Because from where I'm standing," he continued, his voice sharp but never raised, "it looks like the only thing that changed is which side of the glass you're standing on." Silence. A heavy, piercing silence. Even the moderator seemed stunned. Vance leaned back, his expression unreadable, waiting. Calloway blinked, opened his mouth, closed it, and the crowd? They felt it. They saw it. For the first time since this debate began, Calloway wasn't leading. He was losing. And deep down, he knew it. But Calloway wasn't finished yet. His next move was a low blow. Calloway adjusted his tie, exhaling through his nose like a man recalculating his next move. He had felt the shift. He had come into this debate expecting to control the narrative, expecting to corner J.D. Vance with polished talking points and practiced lines. But now he was on the defensive, and he hated it. He needed to hit back. He needed to regain control. And so he went low. "You know, J.D., Calloway started, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "It's funny how people change when the cameras are rolling. You stand here talking about loyalty, about principles, about standing by the people who believed in you." He paused, letting the words simmer. "But tell me," Calloway's voice softened, his eyes narrowing just slightly, "where was that loyalty when you turned your back on your own hometown?" The room stilled. Vance's expression didn't change, but the audience felt it. The shift, the sharp turn toward something personal. Calloway continued, his tone measured but cutting. "You love to tell the story, don't you?" he said, his smirk returning. "The boy from Middletown, Ohio, the struggling family, the hardships, the grit. You've built your entire career on that story." He leaned forward slightly, dropping his voice just enough to make it feel like a secret. "But you don't live there anymore, do you, J.D.?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Vance stayed still. "You don't send your kids to the same schools you grew up in," Calloway continued. "You don't shop at the same grocery stores. You don't stand in line at the same gas stations. No, J.D., you left." The words hung in the air like smoke. "You left and you never looked back." Calloway took his time, watching for a reaction. Vance gave him none. Calloway smiled, just slightly. "That's the difference between us," he said, straightening his posture. "I didn't walk away from the people who raised me. I didn't abandon them when I found success." He turned to the audience, widening his arms. "J.D. Vance says he fights for you. But let's be honest. When was the last time he actually lived like you?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. It was a gut punch, and Calloway knew it. Vance's rise to power had always been tied to his roots, his ability to connect with working-class Americans because he had once been one of them. But now, Calloway had planted a seed of doubt. The cameras zoomed in, capturing Vance's face. Reporters' fingers flew over their keyboards, already crafting the headlines. Has J.D. Vance forgotten where he came from? Ethan Calloway questions Vance's loyalty to his hometown. Calloway settled back against his podium, crossing his arms, satisfied. Vance exhaled slowly. Finally, after a long pause, he tilted his head slightly, studying Calloway like a man seeing something clearly for the first time. Then he spoke. "You done?" The words were soft, but they carried a weight that silenced the room. Calloway's smirk twitched, just slightly. Vance rolled his shoulders, adjusting his stance like a fighter preparing for the next round. "Ethan," he said, his voice steady, almost tired. "Let me tell you something about where I come from." He glanced toward the audience, locking eyes with people in the crowd. "I come from a place where people don't measure loyalty by what zip code you live in." A low murmur. "I come from a place where people don't resent someone for doing better. They cheer for them." The murmur grew. "I come from a place where we don't pull each other down just to make ourselves feel taller." He turned back to Calloway, his voice growing sharper. "But I guess that's a lesson you never learned, did you?" Calloway's face tightened, but Vance wasn't finished. "You want to stand here and talk about loyalty? Fine, let's talk about it." Vance's voice was calm, but with an edge of steel beneath it. "You say I turned my back on Middletown." He shook his head. "But tell me, Ethan, when was the last time you did anything for your hometown that didn't involve a press release?" The crowd reacted. Some gasped, some nodded in agreement. Calloway shifted slightly, his grip tightening on the podium. "Because here's the difference between us," Vance continued, stepping forward. "I never left my people behind. I never forgot where I came from." His voice hardened. "But I also never let my past define my future." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And that, Ethan, is something you'll never understand." Silence, a long, thick silence. Calloway's lips pressed together. He wanted to respond. He wanted to strike back. But he couldn't. Because Vance had just done something Calloway hadn't expected. He hadn't defended himself. He had flipped the script. And now Calloway was the one who looked like the man trying to tear someone down for moving forward. And the audience saw it. And then Vance delivered the knockout punch. For the first time that night, Ethan Calloway didn't have a response. He had come prepared for this debate. He had spent weeks crafting his attacks, rehearsing his counters, sharpening his words like knives. He knew exactly how he wanted this night to go. But now he was standing in front of a crowd that was no longer nodding along with him. Now he was looking at J.D. Vance, the man he thought he could break, and realizing with slow dawning horror that Vance wasn't breaking at all. He was winning. Vance let the silence stretch. He could have spoken right away, but he didn't. He knew the power of a pause. He let the weight of his last words settle into the audience, let them feel it. Then he tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Ethan," he finally said, his voice steady, his tone almost gentle, "I have to ask you something." Calloway's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Vance took a small step forward, his eyes never leaving his opponent. "Do you even believe what you're saying anymore?" The question hit like a hammer. A ripple ran through the audience. Calloway's expression flickered just for a second. Vance kept going. "You stand here," he continued, "acting like you're still the same guy who used to fight beside me, like you're still fighting for the same people, like you're still fighting for anything other than your own career." Calloway opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Vance didn't let up. "But here's the thing, Ethan." His voice wasn't loud. He didn't need it to be. It was precise. It was controlled. "You're not the same man I knew 5 years ago." He shook his head slowly. "You're not fighting the system anymore. You've become it." The audience reacted. Some gasped. Others nodded in agreement. Calloway felt it. The room was shifting against him, and the worst part, there was no way to spin it. Vance kept his eyes locked on him. "You talk about loyalty," he said, his voice softer now, almost like he was speaking to an old friend. "You talk about standing by your principles. But I see what's happening, Ethan." Another pause. "You're trying so hard to convince yourself that you didn't sell out, that you don't even realize how obvious it is that you did." Calloway's face flushed. He shifted his weight. Vance didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The crowd saw it now. Calloway wasn't the challenger anymore. He was the exposed fraud, and Vance had just turned the entire debate against him. And just when Calloway thought it couldn't get worse, Vance exposed his biggest hypocrisy. Ethan Calloway was cornered. Not physically, he still stood at his podium, still had his perfectly tailored suit, still had a microphone in front of him. But in every way that mattered, he was trapped. He had spent years building a public image. He had positioned himself as a man of principles, of conviction, of integrity. But now, under the relentless pressure of Vance's words, that image was starting to crack. And the worst part? The audience could see it. Vance had turned the tables. Calloway wasn't the prosecutor anymore. He was the one on trial. And the people watching were the jury. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Vance, still calm, still composed, tilted his head slightly. "I want to ask you something, Ethan," he said, his voice steady, controlled. Calloway swallowed, didn't answer. Vance leaned forward slightly. "When did you stop believing?" A ripple ran through the crowd. Calloway blinked. "What?" he asked, his voice slightly hoarse. Vance didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. He just let the question hang in the air. Calloway shifted in place. He let out a small, forced chuckle, shaking his head like the question was absurd. "I still believe," he said. "Do you?" Vance cut in, his tone sharper now. "Because I remember the man you used to be, Ethan. I remember the fire in your voice when you talked about fighting for working Americans. I remember the passion you had for holding the elite accountable. I remember the way you'd tell me, over and over, we can't let the media dictate our message." He paused, just for a second. "Now?" He shook his head, a small, almost sad smile on his lips. "Now you sit on their panels. Now you write their talking points." Calloway inhaled sharply. His fingers tightened around the podium. Vance's eyes hardened. "You used to hate them," he said, his voice dropping lower, more pointed. "Now you are them." The audience gasped. Calloway tensed. The flicker of anger in his eyes was unmistakable now. "That's not—" Vance didn't let him finish. "I get it," he continued. "It's tempting, isn't it? The book deals, the TV appearances, the invitations to all the right parties, the handshakes from all the people who used to ignore us." Calloway's mouth pressed into a thin line. He looked away, just briefly, just for a fraction of a second. But the cameras caught it. And that was all the proof the audience needed. "You talk about loyalty," Vance said, his voice ringing through the auditorium. "But the truth is, you weren't loyal to the people. You were loyal to the opportunity." Silence. A long, deafening silence. Calloway's face was unreadable now. His jaw clenched. His nostrils flared slightly. He wanted to argue. But how could he? Vance had just laid out everything. The rise, the fall, the hypocrisy, and Calloway had nothing to stand on. The audience knew it, the reporters knew it, and worst of all, Calloway knew it. The debate was nearly over, but Vance had one final move to make, and it would be the most devastating of all. For the first time in the entire debate, Ethan Calloway had nothing to say. The air in the auditorium was thick with tension. The audience wasn't whispering anymore. They weren't glancing at each other, debating in hushed tones over who had the upper hand. No. Now, they just watched. They watched Calloway, his jaw tight, his fingers clenching and unclenching around the edges of his podium. They watched the anger flicker in his eyes, the sharp inhale he took through his nose, the unmistakable signs of a man who knew he had lost. And then they watched J.D. Vance, calm, composed, unshaken, the same way he had stood at the very beginning of the debate. Vance exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back before leaning forward, just slightly, just enough to send a message. "I want you to remember something, Ethan," he said, his voice softer now, almost conversational. "I never turned my back on the people who believed in me." He let that sit for a moment. Calloway's lip twitched, but he didn't respond. Vance continued, "I never stopped fighting for them. I never stopped standing for the things we said we stood for. The difference between us is simple." His eyes locked onto Calloway. "You didn't change because you grew. You changed because you wanted power." The crowd murmured. Some people nodded. Others looked at Calloway like they were seeing him for the first time. And Calloway? Calloway felt it. His fingers curled into fists on the podium. His eyes burned. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. And then, for the first time that night, he did something that sealed his fate. He looked at the moderator. Not at Vance. Not at the crowd. At the moderator. A silent, desperate plea to move on. To end this. And the audience saw it. They knew. It wasn't just that Calloway had lost. It was that he knew it too. The moderator hesitated, glancing between the two men before finally speaking. I think we should move on." Vance tilted his head slightly. Not quite a smile, not quite a smirk. Just an acknowledgement. It was over. And Calloway? Calloway just nodded stiffly, gripping the edges of his podium like a man trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. Because deep down, past the anger, past the frustration, past whatever pride he had left, he knew one thing for certain. Tonight, in front of the entire country, J.D. Vance had ended him. The debate was over, but before leaving, Vance had one last message, and it was for the American people watching at home. The debate was over. The moderator had barely finished his closing remarks when Ethan Calloway turned away from the podium, grabbed his notes, and made for the exit. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at J.D. Vance. Because he couldn't. The night hadn't gone the way he had planned. He had come here ready to destroy Vance. Instead, he was the one walking away in silence. But Vance wasn't finished. As Calloway moved toward the shadows, away from the bright stage lights, Vance did something that no one expected. He stepped forward, not toward Calloway, not toward the moderator, toward the audience, toward the camera. And just like that, the entire country was watching him. Not just the people in the auditorium, not just the reporters, the strategists, the pundits waiting to dissect the night's events, but the millions sitting at home. The Americans who had tuned in, expecting a political battle, but had instead witnessed something much more, something real. Vance adjusted his tie, exhaled softly, then spoke. "Before we go," he said, his voice steady, measured, commanding the room, "I want to say something to the people watching at home." The room went silent. Even Calloway, halfway to the exit, stopped. "I know there are a lot of you out there," Vance continued, his gaze steady, "who feel like you've been abandoned." A pause. "I know what that feels like. I know what it's like to watch politicians make promises, shake hands, put on their best smile for the cameras, only to forget you the second they walk off the stage." His voice never wavered. "I know what it's like to be told that your values are outdated, that your beliefs are wrong, that the things you hold close to your heart, the things your family, your community, your faith have taught you, aren't acceptable anymore." He let the words settle. "But let me tell you something." His voice grew stronger now. "You're not crazy for believing in tradition. You're not crazy for wanting a government that actually cares about you. You're not crazy for refusing to be ashamed of who you are. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Because the truth is, Vance continued, the people who call you crazy, they don't understand you. And worse, they don't want to understand you. A pause. But I do. His gaze swept the audience, his voice carrying the weight of something real. I haven't forgotten who I am. I haven't forgotten where I come from. And I sure as hell haven't forgotten about you. Silence. Then applause. Not polite, not hesitant. Loud, raw, genuine. People rose from their seats. Not just the ones who had been on his side before the debate started. Everyone. Even some of Calloway's supporters couldn't deny it, because they had just witnessed something rare. Not a man reading from a teleprompter, not a politician spinning the truth, but a man who meant every word he said. The moderator, clearly shaken by the moment, fumbled for a closing statement. But Vance? He didn't need one. He had said everything that needed to be said. And as he walked off the stage, past the thunderous applause, past the flashing cameras, past the stunned silence of Ethan Calloway, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a debate. It was a message. And the people, they had heard it, loud and clear. And that, my friends, is how you win. Not by yelling, not by rage, but by standing firm in what you believe. If you agree, hit that like button and subscribe for more.